Thank you, Kathleen. For those of us gathered here this morning, you know, at least you should know because I told you earlier that I spent the last couple of weeks in California. And before leaving for California, I thought, okay, it's been all rainy and kind of chilly here in Nebraska, and I thought, oh, California is going to be nice and warm. Well, turns out we kind of froze in California. In fact, I'm pretty sure that when we were in San Francisco that Jean had on every long sleeve shirt that she packed along with her as long as the coat we took. It was cold, and we didn't quite realize that it was going to be quite so cold. San Francisco is a cold city in the summertime. The plains get hot, and then the air rises, and the cold air off of the water rushes into the city, and it is chilly, I guess. We would have preferred, cold to like really hot because we did a lot of walking around the streets and things like that, so it was a little more refreshing to be cold. But it was a surprise to us. Finally, at the end of our vacation, we were in Sacramento, and it was hot in Sacramento. Kind of like this last week we had, right? The really hot days, almost 100 earlier in the week, and then here at the end of the week, just barely up into the mid-60s. Up and down, the weather is like that. Hot weather. Kind of good preparation for today's message because we're going to talk about, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. And we use kind of that terminology about, hot things to describe other kinds of heat that we go through in kind of a figurative way. We say we're in hot water when we find ourselves in problems of usually our own making, or we might say that something is too hot to handle, right? When there is a difficult conversation ahead of us, or a subject sure to start an argument might be said to push a hot button. Well, today, in both literal and figurative ways, we talk about heat. Right? Daniel chapter 3, these three young men are in circumstances that both are hot in a figurative sense, full of danger and difficulty, and find themselves literally in the furnace. Here's how the story begins, right? I hope it's familiar to many of you. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and language, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all the other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Nebuchadnezzar's demand creates a crisis for three of his civil servants who have come from Judah, who had through this process of being dragged away from their home, drafted into service of the king, finally given positions of responsibility in Babylon, still not lost their commitment to the God of Israel, the God of their forefathers, the ones who had brought them out of slavery, the one who had enriched and protected, the one who had worked in the experience of their past. But in this circumstance, they face a really big challenge. And in the challenge they face, I want you to notice three things. Three things that could have made them melt, and three things that if you and I let them will, make us melt too. Three things that will make you melt. Again, remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had no choice about the place where they're at. They had no vote in who the king was. They had no influence over what the king did, and they couldn't control how anyone else responded. Think about those three areas in life, right? The authorities over them, the temptations before them, and the people around them. Those three directions are important for you to recognize even in your own situations, because those are the directions that, well, the difficulties often come. And they describe for us those three areas that might make us melt. One thing that would make us melt is making earthly kings our final authorities. Our boss, our teachers, our government. None of these are designed to be the final authority in our lives. And that's very well illustrated by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they stand up and, well, defy King Nebuchadnezzar. Think about what's happened, right? King Nebuchadnezzar has made a colossal effort to design these circumstances, right? He makes this golden image, huge thing. He gathers a big band, right? All these different instruments. He calls all of his civil servants together to worship the image. He can do that. He's the king. Now, I don't think he actually made the statue, right? He conceived the idea and told other people to make it. He didn't go out and actually gather together all these people, but he sent someone. He sent the word. It's his initiative. But what's he thinking? Right? Well, maybe there's a practical motivation behind all of this. In this story, we recognize that these people, well, they've come from lots of different places, right? All of these officials are described in this as, well, people of all races and nations and languages. Remember that Babylon has conquered the world. And as part of their plan for the world, they brought the best of every nation in and used the strengths and the abilities of the best of those nations. That's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there, because he found value in them for Babylon. So practically, this moment, this challenge is there for a very good reason, right? Trying to gather the nation together, create some unity, consolidate his position as the ruler over them. Other kings did similar things. Like in the New Testament, we see that the people in that day are facing, well, emperor worship, right? They wanted to take Caesar and elevate him to a god and make everyone worship Caesar. It's not new. It wasn't new even with Nebuchadnezzar. Those kind of practical considerations. There's also kind of a little bit of a personal gratification thing going on here for King Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, after all, who doesn't love to be worshipped, right? Well, except maybe me or maybe you. You know, we think, oh, no, not me. You don't have to worship me. But we like it when people think highly of us. We don't mind when people appreciate what we do, right? And we wouldn't mind a little bit of, well, compliments every now and then. But if that's your final authority, right, that's a problem. And this little ego trip from Nebuchadnezzar is, well, a little more illustrated when defied, he gets really, really angry, right? Things almost get out of control for him later in this story because people won't do what he wants them to do. Nebuchadnezzar's demand, by setting up this image, is saying that he wants to be acknowledged as the most powerful force in that world. He wants to be the final authority in everyone's life. Recently, I've been following the story of another man trying to confront this reality in his life. It's a Navy chaplain, Chaplain Motter. Wes Motter has recently been relieved of his duties. He had spent the last 19 years as a highly decorated chaplain for the U.S. Navy. He has been involved in Operation Desert Storm. He has been the chaplain for the SEAL teams. He has been there and done that as far as service for his country. And for 19 years, people have appreciated his ministry until just recently, saying exactly the same thing that he has been saying for these last almost 2 decades. Finally, his stance and his biblical authority appeal has been challenged as not quite politically correct, and he has all but been dismissed from service. He's been forbidden daily contact with those he's been ministering to, even to the point where one of those people, Navy personnel that he had a relationship with, had a death in the family. And the Navy forbid him from having contact with his people in that period of loss. Now, it'd be very easy for Chaplain Mater to melt in this time. His whole future is on the line. It's his job. It's how he makes a living. It's how he supports his young family. But no. He has continued to acknowledge before the Navy and really before the nation that his priority is first to serve his God. He is working to defend his rights in the court system, to challenge the ways things have been done because the Navy hasn't even followed their own regulations. Just last year, our own Senate, U.S. Senate, passed a law, federal law, saying that chaplains have this kind of freedom to speak from their convictions. In spite of that, he's still being, well, forced out. But he's not melting in the heat. If you want to follow Chaplain Mater's story, he is being defended and the storyline is being carried on by an organization called the Liberty Institute. And here's the website, libertyinstitute.org, if you would like to follow some of that. Or you could, well, friend me on Facebook, and I'd be happy to continue to post some of those. Or even better than that, you could friend Joel Daring. Joel, one of the members of our church, served with Chaplain Mater in the Navy, knows him personally, and really that's the connection that has made it most meaningful for me. This guy's the real deal, standing up in some pretty, well, threatening moments. Because he has decided to be loyal to God, even if it brings him conflict with his earthly masters. Never stop. And we shouldn't be surprised that this happens. Remember what Jesus said, right? He said, do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me, naturally they will persecute you. Said if they would have listened to me, they would listen to you. They do this, said, because of me. They have rejected me, not you. The earliest Christians found that to be true too. They said things like, Peter wrote to them, and he said things like this, dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Did you catch that fiery trial reference there? Right? It can be that kind of thing. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the world. It can get hot, right? It can get warm. But don't make, even in those times, the earthly kings your authority. That might make things more comfortable in the short term. Oh, it would have been better in that moment, seemingly, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to just give in, to go along with the flow. But they wouldn't do it because they honored their God. Your boss, your teacher, your spouse does not displace God. In fact, you ought to be a better spouse. You ought to be a better student. You ought to be a better teacher. You ought to be a better employee because you ultimately answer to God himself. Secondly, another thing that would make you melt is making things the most important part of life, right? There is a thing in this story, right? There's this big golden statue that the king sets up. It's 90 feet high, it's 9 feet wide, and it's very, very visible. Set up in a big plain, it drew the eye, I'm sure, as it all but glowed in the sunshine. It was an idol. It was designed to take the place of God in the people's hearts, or to remind them of the king's place in their hearts. Remember, the very first two of God's 10 commandments address this issue for God's people. He said, you must not have any other God before me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on earth or in the earth. When you think about things around you, the gravity that they have, whether they're on 4 wheels or 2 wheels, or if they're a house or a prized possession or a hobby, all of those things. Remember a couple of things about things. One, just remember things are always temporary. They do not last. Think of all the things that your grandparents owned, right? And if you're lucky, you have one of them or two of them. We have a house full of furniture, the hand-me-downs, right? And some people begin their lives with furniture from, Salvation Army. We began our lives with furniture from family, and we still have it. And we appreciate those things, right? But when you think about the stuff that used to fill their homes, there's just not much left. And that's just in, 2 generations. Things are always temporary like that. One of the people that lived that had the most things of anybody was King Solomon. He had all sorts of things, right? He had singers, and he had buildings, and he had gold and silver, and he had the wives. I mean, talk about the women. And it was just amazing. And what did he say about all of those things, right? Everything, he said, is meaningless. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. Finally, as he tries to come to grips with what he thought would satisfy his heart, he comes to understand that it was God alone, and to honor God and to enjoy his work and accept your lot in life. That's what he says. This, he says, indeed, is a gift from God. Things, right? They're always temporary, and things have this ability to come into our lives and blind us. What we create or what we enjoy or what we have in our hands can sometimes be a big problem. It's not really that we have those things, but it's where those things are in our lives. I mean, even a little dime, right, can block your sight of what ought to be really important in your life if you hold it right up in front of your eye. Things are like that. It's where you keep them. It's how you keep them that can do it. If they're kept between you, if they're more important to you than God's work and his voice in your life, then for you, they blind. Paul talked about that kind of process in his life in the first chapter of his letter to the Romans. He talked about people that traded the truth about God for a lie. And they worshiped and served the thing God created. You get it? They're worshiping things, these idols. They become idols for them. They worship and serve the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Those things, they can blind us. Things that will make you melt, right? Making earthly kings your final authority, making things the most important part of your life, and finally taking your cues from the crowd. Right? That's what happens, right? You remember? Everybody on the plain of Dura bows down when the music stands. And there, 3 guys are standing up. It's no accident, I think, that the king calls all of his officials together. He's using that kind of peer pressure to get compliance. It's really, really a powerful thing. And everybody else bows down. That would have been a weird feeling. They're standing there and everybody else is bowing down. It's like visiting a large mosque and being invited to join in their worship service, and everybody gets down on their knees and faces Mecca and goes down like that to the ground. And you're standing there. It'd be weird. That's why when you visit a mosque, usually they take you to another room. Watch from outside, right? There was a story that's shared with us in one of Dr. Dobson's classic books, Hide and Seek. It came out in the 70s, so if you've never read it, I'm not surprised. And in it, he tells about an experiment that took place among teenagers, and trying to talk about the peer pressure. And it began with a series of simple charts, something like this, right, where there was 3 lines in the chart, and the group was brought in, and they were told to raise their hands when the instructor pointed to the shortest line. But 9 out of the 10 in the group had been instructed previously to vote for the second shortest line. And over again, they watched that one person kind of left out of the story, and they're unaware that the rest of them have been clued in, go along with the crowd when they all raised their hands for obviously not the shortest line. In fact, they found about 75% of the time the subjects would go along with the crowd, even when it was clear that the crowd was wrong. In the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this crowd pressure is a powerful thing. But it also provided for them an amazing opportunity. Jesus talked about that same kind of reality, that following him never really puts you in with the crowd. He said, the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few ever find it. It can be something almost disconcerting or misleading about worshiping in huge groups. You began to think that everybody agrees with me. And I loved that. I mean, there were 8,000 of us gathered there at council, and the way people sang and the energy in a group that big, it's great, it's wonderful. But it's really not reality. For you and I, taking our cruise from the crowd almost always takes us the wrong way. 3 things that will make you melt. Well, how about 3 things that will help you stand the heat? So everyone bows to the image, right? Everyone except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And in their struggles and in their witness, they get pointed out, right? The people just can't let them go on their own way. Some officials come and they say, hey, King Nebuchadnezzar, there are these 3 guys who you have put in charge of Babylon, and they are not part of this program. Well, that wasn't okay with King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 3, beginning at verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made, and when you hear the sound of musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. And we want to go, yeah, that's really good for them. That's really, really hard for us. Don't miss how this almost is so challenging that we want to just step back from it.